Hey everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We have a very special guest, a longtime friend of mine in the industry. You may know him from the Prosper Show, which is I'm going to tout it for you. It's the largest gathering of Amazon third-party sellers. I'll let James kind of tell us a little bit more about it. He's also with a group called Buy Box Experts. And James, let me see, I got it right here. James wrote a book, and he shared this book with me at a trade show. And after reading through the book, I said, this is some great information, and it's stuff that Amazon sellers need to know, which is, of course, why James wrote the book. And so I asked him to come on and to share it with us and to take some of our questions. So without further ado, James, I welcome you to the Seller Labs community for those that don't know you, and I thank you for coming on and look forward to what you have to share today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff, and your Seller Labs colleagues. Thank you very much for having me. I spent about 6 years at Amazon before I do what I do today, and I got to work with third-party sellers, and I got to work with brands, working on a number of different issues. Having left Amazon about 4 years ago, I now work with brands and private label sellers and exclusive resellers, helping them figure out how do they make the most of the Amazon channel and do that in a way where they still have control over what happens to their brand. I'm sure that many of you who are on the call today are struggling with how do you sell product, but do it in a way where you don't have a bunch of other people piling on, selling what might be legitimate product, what might be counterfeit product. How do you make sure that your pricing is where you want it to be? How do you make sure your brand's being represented the way you want it to be? I keep hearing the same questions over and over again. So my business partner, Joe Hansen, he and I decided that we had so much spare time in our lives that we would write a book. It turns out we didn't have a lot of spare time, but writing a book was important for getting people to start thinking about how do you think about your brand on Amazon? And really, there are two major questions that we believe every brand needs to ask itself. The first one, and it may seem obvious, but nonetheless important for brands to think through is my brand, do I actually want to have it sold on Amazon? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is it doesn't really matter whether you want it to be sold on Amazon. As your brand continues to grow and be accessed by more customers and more channels, chances are your brand's going to end up on Amazon anyways, whether you want it to be there or not. And let me give you a little bit of an absurd situation. Let's say somebody buys one of your products. Let's say they buy it through a brick-and-mortar channel. And I'm going to make up, again, this is an absurd example, but one that could legitimately happen to any brand owner who's on the call today. But let's say somebody buys that product and sends it off to their grandson as a birthday gift. Little Johnny doesn't want that gift and decides that he's going to sell it back. He's going to sell it on Amazon. He goes on Amazon, there's no listing. He decides, well, I'm going to sell it, so I'm going to create a really superficial listing on Amazon, and I'm going to start selling the brand. And it's not that there's necessarily a lot of inventory, but even with a single unit of product, somebody who isn't a seller that you know, who doesn't necessarily represent your brand the way you want it to be represented, is going and creating listings and putting those listings on Amazon, and now your product has an Amazon listing, albeit incomplete or low quality or cell phone photos being used as the main image. It's not necessarily consistent with everything that you're doing to try to build and manage your brand equity across your brand in all the channels you sell it. So the first question around, will the brand be sold on the Amazon Marketplace? It turns out whether you're a big brand, a medium brand, or a small brand, if you've got any decent traction with consumers in any type of channel, it's just a matter of time before your brand will be sold on Amazon. And so you have to ask yourself the question, what are you going to do to make sure that if it is sold on Amazon, that you still retain some types of control over what happens to your brand? And so we get to the second question around what distribution approach makes the most sense for the brand. In our book, we cover a number of different issues around distribution. We start by looking at what are all the different approaches someone can take to getting their brand distributed. But we also look at, once you make that distribution choice, there's a number of implicit and explicit assumptions that go into what the approach is that's best for your particular brand. You might be a brand that doesn't have any retail, or excuse me, brick and mortar presence today. You may be a brand that's sold all over the world. You may be a brand where you're the only reseller of the product. Depending on what the different types of issues are outside of Amazon, you may make different choices today around how you want to have your product distributed. At the end of the day, no matter what you do as a brand, you have to recognize that Amazon's here to stay, and somebody out there is going to find your product, and if they believe there's money to be made selling it, they're going to list it on Amazon. So what are you doing as a brand owner to make sure that you're protecting your brand? So let's look at a couple of different frameworks here. As a brand, there are a number of things that you need to control, not just on Amazon, but we'll start with what needs to happen on Amazon. And the first and most important issue is your branding, the brand content. It doesn't matter whether you want your product to be sold on Amazon. It doesn't matter who the seller might be that is selling your product. You're a brand. You've invested in building brand equity and creating a message, a set of promises for customers. And if you're not controlling how your brand is being perceived or how it's being presented to customers on Amazon, then you're at risk of your brand being underrepresented, incorrectly represented, or just in general poorly represented to customers, creating potential damage for your brand. We've worked with a number of brands who don't proactively want to sell on Amazon, but as we've said to them, at a minimum, you need to make sure that your catalog of content is properly locked down in Amazon so that somebody can't come along and mess it all up, even if you don't want them to be selling. Here's something interesting to think about with brand content. That example I gave you of the kid that decides to sell back the product on Amazon, if he's creating a low-grade listing, it is entirely possible, given the amount of traffic that Amazon gets today, it's entirely possible that Google may index that listing, and it could potentially end up with a higher listing in the search results on Google. That poor quality listing could end up with more visibility than the listing you might build on your own brand page on your own website. And so it's important to recognize Amazon is this huge location of content. And if you don't manage that content effectively, someone could potentially do some damage to your brand. So thinking about branding, who's creating your listing? Who's making sure that the high quality content's being put in place? Is the content being optimized? Optimization becomes more important if you're actually trying to use Amazon as a sales channel, but you want to make sure that the content is high quality so that as consumers come onto the Amazon site and start looking at products like yours, whether it's your competitors, whether it's yours, does your product get presented as an option that actually makes sense for consumers to consider? Some of you have probably experienced having your brands being posted on Amazon with sellers who are making up UPC codes. They're making up duplicate UPC codes. Maybe they're buying secondary UPCs and applying them and creating situations where, because the Amazon catalog is all based off of UPC data, you may well end up having unnecessary duplicate listings where you've got your high quality listing and then somebody else's duplicate listing being used under a different UPC. These are all ways to try to potentially harm your brand, where if the content isn't being properly regulated, properly managed, your brand may not be getting the best representation on the channel. So regardless of what you choose to do around selling the product, at a minimum, you want to make sure that your brand is properly represented on Amazon so that people don't come along and misrepresent or underrepresent what your brand is supposed to stand for. The second major pillar of issues that we run into with brands is what does my pricing look like on Amazon? And in fact, for a lot of folks, the first conversation they have about Amazon is they wake up one day and discover, hey, my product's being sold on Amazon by somebody I don't know at some price point that's almost always inconsistent with what the brand wants to see its products being sold at. So is the product being sold at a price on Amazon that's likely to affect your ability to keep your brick and mortar retailers happy? In many situations, it's complaints from brick and mortar partners that make you aware that in fact there's a pricing issue on Amazon. For many brands, they say, okay, our product's 20% cheaper on Amazon. It's being sold by a bunch of companies. We don't know who they are. What do we do? Well, that gets us then from a pricing discussion into a distribution discussion. If you can't control what's happening with your distribution, then chances are you're not going to be in a position to have a meaningful voice around how your product is ultimately priced on Amazon. So who's selling your product? Can you identify these sellers? Have you given specific companies the right to sell your product on Amazon? Versus have you proactively put together an online reseller policy, communicated that with all of your channels to make sure that in fact your voice around who you do or don't want to see selling your product has been put in place. There are some very specific laws that need to be paid attention to here in terms of how you enforce who does or doesn't have the right to sell the product on Amazon. But the most important thing to keep in mind here is there are paths to making sure that only certain sellers have the right to sell your product on Amazon. And to the extent that there are other companies operating under a DBA or who are trying to hide their identity, maybe they're professional gray market sellers, maybe they're some of your brick and mortar retailers who've decided to have a side business selling online, and many other types of models where people get access to product. Amazon has no interest in addressing distribution strategy of a brand. It's up to the brand and its retailers to address any type of distribution strategy. Amazon, as I'm sure many of you have seen when you file complaints, Amazon will make clear that they're not interested in enforcing a brand's distribution strategy. So the brand has to work out those issues outside of Amazon and figure out how do they tightly control who's got access to product, how do they tightly control who among those companies has the right to sell on Amazon. If somebody is selling the product on Amazon who's not supposed to be, it's up to the brand to police that, and most of that policing has got to be done outside of Amazon. So how do you figure out who those sellers are? How do you communicate with them and say, hey guys, we don't want you selling on Amazon? There are legal maneuvers that can be used, but for the all-intensive summary here, the key is it's up to the brand to figure out who's distributing the product so that they can have some sort of clear voice around how the product ultimately gets priced, as well as how the product ultimately gets presented as a brand on the Amazon site. And then finally, there are two other parts of this discussion that we think every brand should be considering, even if they've got their branding content down, even if they've got their distribution and pricing down. The question around how do they make sure that their catalog selection is consistent with what they want on Amazon? How do they make sure that new product selection gets added? How do they make sure that inventory levels are controlled in a way that the brand is always in stock? We've certainly seen many situations where a brand will have a number of authorized sellers selling on Amazon, but because they're not doing some kind of, I dare use the term, central planning of inventory, that is to say, making sure that across all the sellers of their products on Amazon, that there's enough inventory to ensure that the brand remains in stock, especially in high demand times of the year. It's entirely possible a brand could have multiple resellers, and yet they still go out of stock because none of those resellers together have adequately ensured that there's enough supply of product. For brands that, or I guess for any listing that goes out of stock, after 7 days, after 30 days, after 60 days, Amazon starts to punish you from a search algorithm perspective. If you can't keep the product in stock, your brand becomes less and less relevant. And so it's important to understand how do you maintain certain minimum inventory levels, even if it's meant to be done across multiple sellers, to ensure that your brand remains relevant on Amazon and not out of stock, thereby giving your competitors an opportunity to capture sales simply because you're not able to do some sort of inventory management across all the different resellers. Once you address all these different types of questions around what we call the key pillars, the key issues that a brand needs to think about, not just for Amazon, but certainly critical to the Amazon discussion, then we get into a whole section in our book where we start covering off what are the different major distribution models that a brand can use. And that's where we get into this particular map that you see here, where if we start in the bottom left corner, we have a very simplistic chart here that says, let's start with two critical issues that brands think about today. how much control does the brand have over what's going on with its brand on Amazon, and then how much daily involvement is required for them to be able to address and maintain brand equity on the platform. So start in the bottom left corner. What is often, unfortunately, the case with a lot of brands, they have absolutely no proactive plan. The resellers are selling without any brand guidance. So whether that's companies that haven't been authorized to sell on Amazon or selling on Amazon, or the brand doesn't have a proactive Amazon strategy, and lo and behold, the product shows up. But this is the kind of situation we run into a lot with companies saying to us, we woke up one morning, discovered our products on Amazon, we don't know who any of these sellers are, can you help us figure out what we're supposed to do? Well, excuse me, for a lot of brands, after they've woken up and realized whether they want it or not, the brand is being sold on Amazon, an easy first choice for a lot of brands is, well, why don't we wholesale the product to Amazon? Amazon first party wants to buy the product. If they have the product, well, then that should help us solve a lot of these problems around distribution, around pricing, around inventory levels. That's not always the case, and in fact, if the brand doesn't have tight control of its distribution today, Amazon first party, as I'm sure many of you know, they will aggressively match prices, lower prices that they find on other sites, whether those are online sites or offline sites. Amazon wants to be the low price provider of your brand, and they'll match aggressively to anybody they see anywhere else. So even if you sell product to Amazon first party, with a few exceptions, Amazon is going to make sure that they match other people's lower prices, and any investments around how to create high quality listings, how to make sure your product is always in stock, those problems don't get solved just because you happen to wholesale products to Amazon. We've worked with a number of clients that started out in Vendor Central, and part of their frustration working with first party is that their product continuously was out of stock because Amazon wasn't replenishing purchase orders fast enough. If those products remain out of stock for too long, Amazon's search algorithm punishes the brand, just as I'd mentioned earlier. And so what is the brand doing to make sure its product always remains in stock? Well, that's where we get next to the common situation where brands will ultimately create some sort of a hybrid model where they've got products in first party, products in third party. They may be working with authorized sellers. They may be the seller themselves, but there's different groups of companies that have access to the inventory. And so there's typically a fallback plan where if one company runs out of stock, somebody else still has the product available. And then as we move up to the top right, you have a couple of these other models where a brand will selectively pick certain resellers to represent their brands. They may become the seller themselves. They may pick a single exclusive reseller to represent them, not just in terms of sales, but also to help lock down and optimize content. I've put in the bottom right corner, there are companies like mine, and there are many others that do the same thing that we do, where brands may become the seller of record, and then the day-to-day operations of a third-party account actually gets handed over to another organization to run, allowing the brand to continue to focus on product sourcing and on new product development. This is a cross-section of most of the major distribution approaches that a brand can use, and all of them except the bottom left one are models where there's at least some type of proactiveness on the part of the brand to say the Amazon channel needs to be managed, we need to have a strategy. Obviously there are trade-offs using any one of these distribution approaches, but at the end of the day, it's important to understand a brand needs to have some sort of an approach at a minimum to be able to control its brand content, and then if it's interested in managing distribution and pricing issues and catalog issues, then they're going to have to become more and more involved or have parties representing them that are more and more involved in the activities of the brand. In our book, we actually go through all these different models. We look at about 25 different key tactical issues that each of these different distribution models can impact. Everything from sales tax nexus to ability to do marketing. And as you think about all these different issues, a brand can start to make a better decision around, based on everything that it's doing off of Amazon, what type of distribution approach makes the most sense for them on the Amazon channel. So here are some of the types of issues that we cover off in our book, where we go over and look at the specifics of trade-offs that a brand is going to have to make as it thinks about the different distribution approaches. So 3 major buckets of considerations to think about. There are all the financial issues, internal operational issues impacting the brand and its organization, and then operational issues impacting what happens on Amazon. I don't want to go through all of these. I mean, you can see here on the list, this is just, in fact, just a subset of the issues. But all of these issues need to be considered as a brand starts to think about what model of distribution they want to use if, in fact, they want to proactively manage how their product gets sold on the Amazon site. Things like control over pricing is probably one of the most common questions that we get, and certainly many of you have submitted questions in advance of this webinar, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those issues here in a few minutes. There are questions around how much margin you're ultimately going to make using one model versus another, and we go into extensive detail on different types of financial trade-offs you face if you use one model versus another. When we start to get into some of these internal operational issues, I've talked extensively about who's controlling the way your brand is represented, so the control over branding. How do you make sure that all the promises that you're putting into your brand get correctly, adequately revealed to customers in a way that hopefully will resonate with them, rather than letting little Johnny, who's reselling back your product on Amazon, rather than letting him be the one that decides how your brand is going to get represented. Now, one of the things that I want to mention with regards to certainly with Seller Labs is in the business of helping companies with feedback and with product reviews. And one of the big trade-offs that we see when you decide to do first party, when you wholesale products to Amazon, your ability to get customer feedback and your ability to get product reviews, certainly those are diminished significantly. There are still some ways to get some feedback or some product reviews, but if you're a brand that's still fairly new or not necessarily well known to consumers, it's important to have feedback from customers to help the next prospective customer get a better sense of what your brand is all about. And then finally, we get into some of these Amazon-facing issues where, excuse me, where some of the flexibility of being able to sell in other markets or fulfill in other markets or deal with some of the listing characteristics, these are all the kinds of issues that we go into in quite a lot of depth in our book to help brands understand that there's a number of issues here that are going to impact several different groups within their company. It's not just we want to sell on Amazon and make a bunch of money. It's we want to sell on Amazon, make sure that we have control over what happens to our brand while at the same time making a bunch of money, while at the same time not creating a bunch of channel conflict for every other channel where the brand might also be sold. So as you think about what it means for your brand to be sold on Amazon, it's not just another sales channel like you might sell in Home Depot or Bed Bath & Beyond or eBay or what have you. Amazon really is a channel where if you don't have your act together on a comprehensive global distribution strategy for your brand, all of your distribution sins are going to surface on Amazon. All those things you haven't properly thought through are going to show up and create problems for you on Amazon where other companies are selling your product, other companies are deciding how to price your product, other companies are making decisions about your branding, making decisions about what products are or are not in stock, and so on and so forth. So Amazon really is a unique channel for brands to think about because it has such extensive tentacles impacting all the other parts of your business, both online and off. So with that, if any of you are interested in reading the book, it's amusingly enough available on Amazon, but I'm certainly at this point happy to answer questions and would ask Jeff and Tyler if they could help to ask some of these questions at this point.
Thanks, James. I appreciate that, and I think that what sellers need to realize is there's a difference, and I actually want to ask this question, right? So I wanted to ask this question. It's kind of popped into my head, and the question is
Sure.
Are you a brand or a private label? So this is kind of a question I want to ask all the people that are on this, and then for us to kind of discuss. Are you a brand or are you a private label, right? Because these are kind of interchangeable terms that that people don't really seem to understand the difference of. So give you guys a second here to vote. See if you consider yourself a brand owner or a private label. Still got some results coming in, pretty heavy in the brand and in the private label. So while we're waiting on the final numbers to come in here, James, explain in your mind the difference between a brand and a private label, a private labeler.
Well, why don't I use how Amazon thinks about this? There is the brand registry program. In fact, it's recently been enhanced, and some people call it the new brand registry. Some call it brand registry 2.0. But basically, it's a platform by which you as a brand go in and demonstrate that you have a registered trademark. You may or may not have patents. It doesn't matter. But you've gone through the process of getting a registered trademark. If you have a registered U.S. trademark, you've got a trademark number, you have packaging, you have logos, Amazon will respect you as a brand. If you go through that process, you get approved for brand registry, they recognize you as a brand. I don't care what the brand is called. I don't care what it is you sell. Amazon views that as a brand. As far as Amazon's concerned, if they recognize you as a brand, they give you certain rights to control what happens to your brand on Amazon. They make it easier for you to be able to file counterfeit complaints, to file trademark complaints, to file complaints about your brand being abused in just about any way other than, oh, somebody I don't know is selling my product at a price that I don't like. Amazon's not interested in that.
I think that's a big misconception, right? So let's just make sure we're very clear about that. Nothing with brand registry stops you from letting somebody else sell your product, right?
Brand registry does nothing to control pricing or distribution issues, correct.
So there's quite a bit of questions in both the questions before and these current questions about brand registry. So I think just to kind of recap it for people, brand registry 2.0, new brand registry, whatever you call it, is designed to really help brands protect their trademark and their intellectual property, right?
That's correct. It does nothing to gate your brand. It does nothing to ensure your pricing is going to be at a price level that you want. It does none of that stuff. And so the typical issues that brands on Amazon, and especially private labelers when they're starting, everybody wants to be the exclusive reseller of their own brand. Everybody wants to be in a situation that whether it's unauthorized sellers they're trying to address or counterfeit sellers, that they've got an easy path to getting that done. There are very, very few brands that have been gated on Amazon. There are ways to try to get your brand gated, but typically there's two major conditions that need to be in place before Amazon has any interest in even talking to you. Number one, you have to have a long history of counterfeit product problems. You can show Amazon and say, listen, our product is getting hammered by counterfeits, and we basically can't keep doing what we're doing because all we're doing is managing the removal of counterfeits. The second issue is if your product is likely to have a high likelihood of creating customer harm for the Amazon customer, either because the product goes on the skin or in the body, then if you've got both those conditions, so both the counterfeit problem as well as the high likelihood of customer harm, then in those situations you can submit a ticket to Amazon and say, we have a systematic problem here. Here's the data of all the counterfeits. Here's the data of the customer harm or customer confusion that could create customer harm that we need to address. We need to ask to get our brand gated. I will tell you, this is like finding the lucky leprechaun at the end of the rainbow. Amazon does not take lightly the request to get your brand gated. So the likelihood of you getting your brand gated is very small, but the chances certainly improve if you meet those two conditions of extensive counterfeit history as well as high likelihood of customer harm because of products on the skin or in the body. If your products don't meet don't meet both of those criteria, you have to ask yourself a very different question, which is, what are you doing to proactively manage the distribution of your product? You will not get your brand gated So you need to think about, what are you going to do to control what happens with distribution? What are you doing to make sure that your products don't get diverted by some retailer or some distributor? One of the things we cover in our book, we have a whole section that we talk about some of the technology opportunities available to you to be able to put certain types of features on your product that allow you to track who's diverting your product. So you can track down and have a conversation with these distributors that are diverting. You can say, wait a minute, we have an online reseller policy, and yet you're choosing to divert, and we have the evidence here because we can track it back to an RF tag, we can track it back to, invisible ink. We've got a way to be able to say, we know this came through you, we've caught you red-handed, this is your first warning and only warning, or maybe you don't give them a warning and you just shut them off. The reality is, and I want to be very clear about this, the reality is, if you want to control your brand equity, not just on Amazon, but anywhere, there is a cost to controlling your brand equity. You can't have maximum sales and maximum control at the same time. If you had maximum sales, it would be a free-for-all. And for many brands on Amazon, it is a free-for-all. And that's what causes the products eventually to be sold at 20 to 30% off list, and they have 150 companies selling the product. They don't know who any of them are. That's your maximum sales model, but there's zero control. So if you want to be in a situation where you're building long-term brand equity and you have control over what's going on, and you've got yourself a situation where you're building a brand that has meaningful value, that at some point you could sell that brand, you're going to need to have control mechanisms in place to make sure that you know what's going on with your distribution, you know what's going on with your pricing, you know what's going on to make sure your product stays in stock, you know what's going on to make sure that your branding is consistent on Amazon, just as it is with all of your efforts and all the other online and offline channels where you sell your product.
Do you have a, obviously you're not going to recite it on this webinar, but do you reference either on your website or in the book, I don't remember it, what a good reseller policy looks like, or what should be included in that?
So I'm not an attorney. I'm happy to share names of companies that people can reach out to have those conversations. The reality is, to put a really good online reseller policy together, it is going to be very dependent on the types of distribution that are already in place for a particular brand. If you have no brick and mortar distribution, you're going to have a different online reseller policy than if you have one where you have your own store versus you have one where you've got stores overseas. So there are companies that specialize in online reseller policies. We work very closely with a company called Voris. In fact, I put two different names, two different resources here that brands can use if they're looking to build an online reseller policy. I'm not picking either one of them. We've actually worked with both of these companies at one point or another. But these are law firms that specialize, among other things, in helping brands to put together the right kind of controls so that they can create an online reseller policy, they can address trademark violations, they can do the necessary things to not necessarily keep Amazon completely clean of all sellers that are breaking trademark or all sellers that are dealing with counterfeits, but doing the right things to put enough roadblocks in the way that your brand becomes a whole lot less interesting to some fly-by-night seller or some sophisticated gray market seller, and they're just going to move on to some other brand. That's really the game you're playing here. Think of the group of gazelles running through the jungle, or sorry, running through southern Africa. It's not about being the fastest gazelle. It's about making sure you're not the slowest gazelle when the lion is hungry. That's really a lot of the same kinds of mentality you have to think about as you think about yourself as a brand. What are you doing to put enough controls in place that you become less attractive to any retailer that decides to set up a DBA and conceal the diverted products they're selling on Amazon? Those are the kinds of things that are well worth thinking through. So
let me just kind of ask let me ask kind of
sure.
a splinter question of that. I have some highlighted notes in my book, so I'm considering this my my circle to talk to the author. So I want to get into this in 1 second. I know we're limited on time,
Sure.
but if I'm a reseller and I have a wholesale relationship, then I want to take the reverse attitude of this. I want to understand what my manufacturer's reseller policy is. So if a manufacturer has a reseller policy that states that you cannot sell product on Amazon, okay,
Yep.
and then
Yep.
I go and I sell product on Amazon, the manufacturer can stop selling me products, but they can't actually stop me from selling on Amazon, because you said before that you can't use it as a gating.
Let's just put it this way. There are legal mechanisms that brands could take to create trademark violations where they would demonstrate that you, in fact, are violating trademark by selling the product on Amazon. I'm not going to go to the specifics. I would encourage you to talk to one of the attorneys that I mentioned earlier. The reality is, first sale doctrine is not a long-term protection for companies that decide to sell product on Amazon when the brand is not only clearly communicating a online reseller policy, but also choosing to proactively police that online reseller policy.
Gotcha.
So
that's kind of the point. That's kind of the point, right? Like that's the point, is that you as a seller, I want to move on because I don't want to get stuck on brand registry. And you and I knew this was going to happen because it's such a hot topic right now.
Yep.
And we might want to message these two attorneys and let them know that they might have a few hundred people reaching out to them today. But I'm sure they'd love to hear from you, and tell them that you heard us on this webinar. They're familiar with both of us and will know what we're talking about. Okay, so I'm going into my highlighted notes here. You talk about the idea, and it's a big dilemma that brands have to deal with, of selling to or selling on Amazon. You touched a little bit about it, but I really liked in the book how you went through kind of the 5 pillars that you have to kind of talk about. So, you kind of talked about them within your system, that, you've got these 5 pillars that you have to be considering, which really helps you figure out whether you're going to sell to Amazon or on Amazon. And then one other question that was asked was, can you register to sell to Amazon but not actually sell to Amazon, to where you kind of get first-party opportunities but never actually fulfill a purchase order?
Sure. So one of the most effective approaches that many brands will use is they'll build a hybrid model. They will sell some products first-party. They will sell some products third-party. For some brands we've seen, they will build a hybrid model where essentially they find a handful of sacrificial SKUs that they choose to make available through Vendor Central. That way they can get access to all the Vendor Central promotional tools and marketing tools. Or there may be products where the financials simply don't work out for them to sell them through FBA. And so if Amazon Retail can make a go of it, they're happy to see their products being sold through Vendor Central. We've also seen situations where the brand will specifically, they may start off on first party and Vendor Central, and over time they may migrate some products over to third party. Amazon has certain rules about basically giving them access on the Vendor Central side to any product. As we've seen many brands do, especially if they have a lot of new products, they won't make some of the new product catalog available to Amazon Retail, and they'll simply make that available through third-party opportunities, whether that's exclusive resellers, whether that's a number of authorized resellers, or whether that's through an online reseller account that they own under some other legal entity. But in all situations, if you want access to Vendor Central, you want access to AMS, you have to have at least one product that you're making available to Amazon through Vendor Central or through Vendor Express. In either situation, you can get access to AMS, you can get access to some of the enhanced listing tools, which are, I believe, better on the 1P side than on the 3P side. But the reality is, things like enhanced brand content, while it's not quite as good as A+ detail page content, it's certainly a very big improvement this year over what we've seen in years past. But to be able to do things like headline ads or to advertise on your competitors' detail pages, you're going to have an AMS account, and you can only get that if you've got an active Vendor Central or Vendor Express account.
Okay, so we have kind of a hard stop here in 4 minutes. I want to know who of the people that are attending, who's interested and would like a copy of this book. Just go ahead and type the word book into the question marks. We are going to purchase 5 books, and we're going to give them away. And would you be, and we'll ship them to you. We'll use Amazon Prime, right? So we'll make it really easy. So if you're interested in a book, let us know. Say book in the comments, and we will select 5 winners. Looks like a few people want a copy of your book. And then can you put the slide back up with a URL so people can see your kind of final contact information? You, throughout your book, in one of your chapters, I think it's chapter 3, you define the Amazon strategy, and you talk about these 6 potential Amazon strategies, right? And I love the first one. The first one is do nothing, and then 1P, 3P, exclusive 3P, and then and you go through these, the blended 1P, 3P, the selling exclusive 3P seller of record, right? So it's these, you define these strategies, and I think that this is where a lot of companies need to start, is in defining this strategy. And then really from that point forward, right, from that point forward, you start to look at all of these problems, or dilemmas as you call them, that a seller has, and how each one of these strategies can affect, or how choosing the strategy affects that. Is there one strategy, it's a silly question, is there one strategy that you see works better or worse for certain type of people, or are most people in some type of hybrid approach? Like if I'm strictly a 1P seller, should I be considering adopting another strategy? And if I'm a 3P seller, should I be thinking long-term towards growing towards another strategy?
If for no other reason than to be able to access all of the Amazon first-party promotional tools, I think you have to have at least some 1P presence. If you want to be able to do experimentation and try new bundles and new flavors and new product sizes, you need to have some sort of a 3P presence. So I think it's important to understand what the specific reason for having products in each different approach, what that reason actually is. At the end of the day, you want to have control over what happens to your brand no matter what. Whether the brand is the one that's the seller, or the brand is, controlling the reins of authorized resellers, but you want to know what's going on to your brand. You want to be able to use this amazingly huge marketplace of sellers who are buying everything and anything under the sun. You want to be able to experiment on this channel. You want to be able to do things where you're not completely reliant on Amazon to place a PO, but on the other side, you want to be able to leverage all the tools that are being made available to sellers, to brands when they do choose to work through the first party platform. So we're big fans of the hybrid model. Obviously, the blend of how much goes 1P, how much goes 3P is going to vary, both in terms of what your comfort zone is managing a lot of 3P, but also how strategic your brand is to a potential vendor manager who would say, you know what, we have no interest in you selling anything through 3P. We want all of it in 1P. The problem is, even if all of it's available to Amazon retail through 1P, they're going to stock out. They're going to decide to crap out certain products because the margins don't work for them. So who's going to sell your products on those particular items? And so we really like the hybrid model. You have to think through how you're going to manage this part of your catalog here and that's part of your catalog over there. But we really like that approach all in all, compared to just a simple, let's do all 1P or let's do all 3P.
Awesome. I completely agree with that. I always enjoy talking to you. This is kind of, for people that don't know, James and I, this is the conversations we kind of have when we just get together, and it's awesome that we can actually kind of record it. It sounds really dorky, but it is true, right? Like, it's good that we could just kind of record it and share it with everybody. If people are interested in Prosper, right? So let's just kind of tell people on this about the Prosper show. Then you don't know I'm going to do this, but I'm going to give away a free Prosper ticket to somebody that's on this webinar. So
Great.
Let's tell people about Prosper, and then if you're interested in going to Prosper or learning more about Prosper, put the word Prosper in the questions, and we'll make sure we follow up with you about the Prosper show, and we also we'll select one winner, and when we send out the recap, we'll let you know who the 5 book winners are and the one Prosper ticket winner is.
Fantastic. So Prosper Show is an annual continuing education event that we do for sellers that we view as established sellers. It's not a newbie show. It's for sellers that have already been through hopefully one holiday season and are trying to figure out how to get best practice knowledge on all different parts of their business. We bring together 25 to 35 different panels and sessions over a 2-day period. We're doing our event next in Las Vegas, March 13th, 14th. Tickets haven't gone on sale quite yet, but will be shortly. If you're interested in learning more, again, put Prosper in the place that Jeff had mentioned, and I'll be happy to get you information when tickets go on sale. Our biggest complaint that we've received over the last 2 years at our show is that we have too much content at our show. I will be happy to be guilty of providing too much high-quality content. It is intensive 2 days of training. There's well over 1,000 sellers that come to our event. Phenomenal networking opportunities with other like-minded sellers. So if you're looking to invest in your company over a couple of days next March, certainly consider us. You can go to prospershow.com, sign up for further information when tickets become available.
Yeah,
appreciate the opportunity to chat about that, Jeff.
Yeah, definitely. Prosper, as you know, is one of my highest rated shows. I've been talking about it really since it started. I've enjoyed it, and we're happy to be sponsors of the show. Seller Labs is a sponsor. Seller Labs also has been asked to speak, so we've spoken at the show,
Yep.
and
Yep.
what we love about it is the high level of conversation. So you talked about the high level of the content and the presentations. The types of conversations that we have at that show is just different than conversations we have at other shows. It's just a very high level, very smart sellers in the platform. I literally, I think I saw James for 5 minutes at the beginning of the show and 5 minutes at the end because I was so busy and he was so busy. And that's just, it's an exhausting show. I'll admit it. I'm exhausted at the end of that show, but it's so much fun. So I appreciate it. I know you guys put a lot of hard work into it. It doesn't come together on its own. Thank you for sharing everything today. I think this was amazing content. It's something sellers really need to think about. Brands definitely need to think about. Go back. You'll get a recording of this. Go back and give a listen. You know, digest it. If you have more questions, you can reach out to us. You can reach out to James, and we will share all of the comments from this. So thank you all. Everyone have a great day, and we will see you soon.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Thank you all for joining. Take care.